Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and today we're going to talk about the Krumlauf, where it came from, and what it led to after World War II, and how it actually happened. I think it is a fantastically perfect stereotypical example of the bonkers Nazi German weapons development programs of especially late World War II. So today, if you haven't seen it, today Garand Thumb actually posted video of him shooting an original World War II German Krumlauf, which is absolutely bonkers. I've never had the chance to. I would love to have the chance to try it, although frankly I'd be kind of terrified that it might break. You should definitely check out his video and see his experience of actually shooting one. But I figured you might, having seen that, be interested in knowing a little bit more about the backstory, where this came from and what happened with it. So before we go any further, let me point out that there is a fantastic section on the development of the German Krumlaufs in Sturmgewehr by Hans-Dieter Hundrich. The book is, I'm almost certain, out of print now, but there's like a dozen-page section detailing all sorts of information about the development of this thing, because there's all sorts of variations and details, like I said, stereotypical late war German production project. So this is my primary reference. We've got a couple other references elsewhere that I'm going to pull on for this video. But let's start at the beginning. The Krumlauf is, if you're not familiar with it, is a curved barrel attachment for a rifle. Generally, the ones that are actually out there, like the one that Garand Thumb shot, were made to attach to the Sturmgewehr 44. That was the most practical thing that the Germans came up with them. But that's not actually where it started. So it began much earlier in the war, like in 1943, I think, specifically for armored vehicles. And the idea was, if you have a machine gun mounted on the top of a tank or hull mounted, well, specifically they were concerned about mounted on top of an armored vehicle, there's sort of this dead zone where the gun can't depress far enough to hit infantry that are fairly close to the vehicle. And the solution to this concern was the idea that we could take a regular rifle and put it inside the vehicle, or early on this was actually done with machine guns. They tested this with the MG34s. And we put a 90-degree curved barrel on it so that the gun is pointing upward, so there's room for it in the confines of a small armored vehicle. And the guy shooting it is completely protected, and you give him a periscope sort of sighting device, and you allow the gun to be tilted fairly sharply downward. And they realized, like, we can get the dead zone down to just like 10 or 15 meters past the edge of a vehicle, where we'll be able to actually shoot at enemy soldiers. And this is well, this maybe isn't the best solution to this problem. It is a very real problem, and it is a reasonable sort of solution to investigate. Armored vehicles that don't have infantry close support are often very vulnerable to infantry anti-tank stuff. So anyway, they start developing this, and then in August of 1944, someone sort of spills the beans to Hitler, because he has a meeting with the director of the Ministry of Armaments and Production. And I guess, like, there isn't a recording of this meeting, but he's told about this project, and his reaction is, that would be fantastic. We should also have it for the infantry, so that the infantry can be concealed in trenches, foxholes, that sort of thing, and just pop the gun up and be able to sight somehow over the top of a dugout and shoot down the enemy soldiers without even being visible themselves. Make 20,000 of them. And this being Hitler, the reaction is not, sir, we don't actually have a model of it, we can do some development, but there's like a lot of potential problems involved in something like this. No, the answer is, yes, sir, right away, sir, 20,000 it is. And so the Ministry of Arms and Production sends this order over to the General of the Infantry saying, we're making 20,000 of these curved barrel infantry devices, and the General of the Infantry has no clue what this thing is. In fact, Mr. Hundrich here actually found the original order in a German archive, and there's a handwritten note on it from the recipient at the General of Infantry, literally saying, what is this? So it's a project that started for tanks, and then, because Hitler, it becomes an infantry project. And this would start about 9 months of massive experimentation, development, redevelopment, trial, correction, retrial, an iteration on this concept, trying to come up with some version of it that would actually work. Because when Hitler orders 20,000 of them, not only has there not been any significant testing, there isn't even a prototype or a model. It's just a concept, and it goes straight, in Hitler's head, it goes straight from concept to make me 20,000 of them immediately, as many of these projects did. So development will take the form of, first off, they start experimenting on a rifle, on a K98K. And they're using 8mm Mauser ammunition, and they have trouble, not surprisingly. So there's initial skepticism. This, by the way, is done primarily at Rheinmetall Borsig. There's some initial skepticism on the part of the guys there that it would even be possible in the first place, and it turns out it is. But their initial idea is to not have an enclosed barrel that curves, but have a regular barrel and then like a scoop-shaped curve. The idea being, if we try and curve the barrel, it'll oval itself out, and then bullets will get stuck and they'll deform and they'll break up, and it'll be hopeless. So they try this scoop thing where the inside is actually open. That doesn't work well. It's not durable. It causes problems. So they eventually end up realizing that, yeah, we can actually bend the barrel, and experiments ensue with curves between 30 degrees and 90 degrees. They do 30s, they do 40s, they do 45s. And this project has sort of split, where you have the I version, or it's usually recorded as the J version for infantry, and the P version for tanks. And I'm going to talk about the infantry version here. The tank version essentially actually goes into very limited production by the end of the war, as in like something like 1,500 of them actually made. It's not clear exactly where they were allocated or how many of them actually got into the field, but this was a concept that was at least feasible in armored vehicles. But it's the infantry ones that people always talk about. So by the way, the German Museum in Koblenz has a fantastic example of a Sturmgewehr 44 set up with the P version of Krumlauf on display. It's right here. That was the thing, but that was separate from the infantry version. Now, there are a couple one of the issues with the infantry version is, how do you aim it? And this isn't a problem with the tank version, because the tank versions are basically always set up in these elaborate ball mounts with periscopic sights that can go down into the vehicle, and everything's clamped together, and you don't have to worry about it being lightweight or particularly durable, because it's not like you're actually going to drop the thing because it's clamped into a vehicle. It's a complex problem, but it's easier to solve for the tank versions. For the infantry, they come up with eventually 3 different options. One is we mount sights on the curved barrel attachment itself. One is we mount sights on the gun itself, the Sturmgewehr. And one is we mount sights on the helmet. And this will be great because it'll double as a trench periscope, and we're going to clamp this onto the soldier's helmet somehow. Unfortunately, sadly, very sadly, I don't have any pictures or even diagrams or anything of what one of the experimental helmet-mounted sights for a Krumlauf would have looked like, but I can only imagine something like that goofy British patent for the pith helmet-mounted cannon. Anyway, I should back up a second and say, once they realized that this, at Rheinmetall, once they realized that this thing was actually going to work, the Sturmgewehr was being adopted in theory as the new standard infantry rifle. It was going to be the thing going forward. And its 8x33 Kurz cartridge was a lot more practical for this sort of curved barrel development than 8x57, because the bullet was going slower. It's a slightly shorter bullet, and it's traveling slower. There's less pressure involved, and fewer, not none, but fewer catastrophic failures of the devices. So they fairly quickly transitioned everything to experimentation with the Sturmgewehr. And that's what you always see these things mounted on. So they're experimenting with different curvatures. They have issues of recoil control, because you're holding the gun at this sharp upward angle, but the recoil is directed this direction, so it's very hard to control it, especially in full auto. Accuracy is not good. There's a major field trial in November of 1944. That's probably the biggest single field trial of these things, and they have problems with accuracy. The version that we end up seeing actually go into none of them went into serial production, but the version you see, it's a version that Grand Thumb shot, the version that I have a previous video on as well, about 100 of them were ultimately actually made, and they're the version that has sights mounted on the clamp-on curved barrel assembly. During testing, they found that those sights, in fact, sights on both the barrel-mounted ones and the rifle-mounted sights broke. The materials were not great. The rifle-mounted or the barrel-mounted sights had issues. They would get dirt on them. Rain would cause problems when you got raindrops on the little mirror that allowed you to see the sights. In the cold, snow or ice getting onto them was a real problem. They had problems with the barrels actually rupturing in as few as 60 rounds. Instead of curving, the bullet would weaken the barrel over time, and then boo, bullet goes straight out the side and the barrel's broken. They had one of the rifle-mounted sights. They had issues where the sight came loose. It was mounted to the front end of the Sturmgewehr, and when they tried to tighten the sight down enough for it to work, they ended up bending the receiver of the Sturmgewehr, which impacted the gas system, and the gun stopped working. This is the whole story of Krumlauf development. Is just one serious failure after another as they try to turn Hitler's fever dream of this device into a practical reality, because you couldn't say no to the guy. So anyway, after the tests in November of 44, they continue to try and redevelop the thing and fix the problems. They end up going for the barrel-mounted sight version, and they're supposed to produce 1,000 of the, well, they're supposed to produce 3,000 of the things. That gets dropped to 1,000. There are some voices of some reason in the Army administration who are looking at this like, this thing has just done terribly in trials. It's inaccurate, it breaks, the sights break. Oh, by the way, just because of the sort of crude, clapped-together nature of the sights, and I'll be very interested to see if Garand Thumb's experience mirrors this. The soldiers in the German tests reported having to aim 2.5 meters high to make a hit using the sights on the barrel. So that's like 9 feet, 8 feet high. Grouping was something like 16 inches at 50 yards, or 50 meters. 40 centimeters at 50 meters was the recorded grouping. Very difficult to control in full auto. Eventually, they make about 100 of these. They go out to field trials, which confirm a lot of these problems. And then basically, the war gets so chaotic that no further development is able to be done. Oh, I should point out, they also at one point during this development decide that in order to make them more effective, why don't we put rifle grenade cup launchers on the end of these things? So it's not just that you're shooting a bullet from under cover, you're shooting a grenade from under cover, and that's even more effective. Which leads me to one of the other problems with them. Sorry, this is just a rambling litany of problems with the Krumlauf, which is like, that's the whole history of these things. At a 30-degree curve, it turned out you couldn't really get low enough in a typical German foxhole to actually fire concealed. You'd be visible out to something like 100 meters if you got the gun high enough to clear vegetation, or if there was no vegetation, you still had to get the gun kind of high, or else you would kick up a ton of dirt because the muzzle would be right at ground level, and that would reveal your shooting position and was considered a problem. So, like, everything about these is problematic. Now, at the end of the war, a number of these things, in fact, the majority of the surviving ones, were captured by various Allied military powers and taken for investigation. And it's funny that, today the tendency of a lot of people is to look at these totally bonkers German late war developments and, wow, that thing is so, mind blown. They came up with the curved barrel shooting around corners thing, which, by the way, is because it was impractical enough that the US and the Russians and the British look at these things and they're like, well, I guess they were for shooting around corners because they don't really work for anything else. But of course, they were never intended to shoot around corners or like around the side of buildings or over vehicles. They were intended to shoot from entrenched positions. Anyway, the US gets its hand on some of these and goes, oh my God, these are awesome. Let's try it on the grease gun. And so the US spends some time experimenting with a Krumlauf device for the M3A1 grease gun. And what's really funny about this is they start with essentially a copy of the German version, and it's actually pretty easy to do on the grease gun because the whole barrel just threads off the gun. So they make a curved barrel that screws in, try that. And it has predictably basically the same problems that the Germans ones do. It's not accurate, it's hard to shoot, it's impractical, and it tends to break. And so then the US takes the same development path that the Germans did, but they do it backwards. They go from the fully enclosed curved barrel to, that doesn't work so well. Maybe if we made it just an open scoop on the end of a straight barrel, and that way the bullet's not actually enclosed and there's no pressure, we're just sort of slingshotting the bullet around a corner. So they try that, and then they discover the exact same problems that the Germans had with that concept, namely, it doesn't really improve your accuracy any, it doesn't improve your reliability really any, and the thing is fragile. Those scoops don't have the physical strength to withstand a lot of shooting, and they tend to straighten out or break or bend. So US does a number of experiments with the grease gun before they give up ultimately. And they're like, actually, this idea is kind of crap. The Russians have a very similar reaction. They capture a Krumlov and they're like, wow, this is awesome. And they take it to a testing range with 1,000 rounds of ammo to test it out. And they do a number of tests. They get through 100 rounds before the thing breaks and they can't fix it. So humorously, even after that result of their testing, they still recommend, like, we should try this. And they do, in fact, make an experimental version for the Papasha, the Spagan, PPSH 41 submachine guns, which a couple of those actually still exist. So I haven't found any specific documentation of British experiments into this. It's typically being done with submachine guns, so if the British did it, I would expect to see it on the Sten gun. It might be that the Sten wasn't really all that suitable to trying to clamp something like this onto the muzzle. It may have been that the British were a little wiser, a little more circumspect in looking at what the potential value of this device was and just didn't bother with it. But the US and the Russians absolutely saw this and had kind of the same reaction that people have today to a lot of German Wunderwaffe, and decided, wow, we gotta try this out. So of course, predictably, none of them work well. Today, there are surviving examples of these experiments in various national arsenal museums. Springfield National Armory, I believe, has at least one of the US grease gun versions. The Russian, honestly, I'm not sure where the Papasha 41s are these days, aside from in Russia. And a small number of surviving original German Krumlovs are out there. Now, like I said, they went through all sorts of iterative developments. The one that you just about always see is that final troop trials version of the infantry model with the big, it's actually made by Zeiss, this big mirror, periscopic mirror sight contrivance on top of it. So if you're interested in this, I highly recommend the book Sturmgewehr. This is the expanded copy, which is definitely the version you want to get. They're all expensive because they're out of print, so get the later expanded one. It's like hundreds of pages expanded from the original printing of the book. It's a great book, tons of information about the Sturmgewehr, including, like I said, a surprisingly lengthy section on the Krumlov. So with that all said, hopefully you guys found this interesting and entertaining. It's just such a perfect German late war project. Like Hitler just invents it basically out of thin air, and then nobody can really say no. So they spend 9 months, dumping valuable military and economic resources into trying to make this really ludicrous thing actually a thing. Anyway, hopefully you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.